We're hearing directly from the journalist who recently interviewed former President Donald Trump for this cover story for Time magazine. Time's national political reporter Eric Cortellessa is a UB graduate, visits Buffalo often. Eric sat down with the former president at Mar-a-Lago last month and also had a follow-up conversation with him. The article about a potential second Trump term is eye-opening. Among the headlines, Mr. Trump says he'd use the National Guard, perhaps active duty military, to carry out the largest deportation in American history. He would potentially fire U.S. attorneys who won't prosecute who he wants, and he would consider tariffs of up to 100% on some imports, despite inflation worries. I asked Eric about that and a whole lot more when we talked a short time ago. Eric, thanks for your time. I know you've done a lot of these interviews because the interview is so newsworthy. Neither Mr. Trump nor Mr. Biden has done very many of these in-depth interviews. It's very substantive, and I went over a few of the highlights there. I wonder, though, beyond sort of, the immigration talk, what he said with U.S. attorneys and also tariffs, what do you think are some of the highlights from the interview, some of the biggest takeaways that you have?
I think a lot of the biggest takeaways are simply the answers to the questions that I posed to him about what he would do with a second term. I think, you mentioned immigration. Donald Trump said that he would embark on a massive deportation operation to remove as many or more than 11 million undocumented migrants from the country. When I asked him whether that would include using the U.S. military inland to haul away and remove those people, he said it might. He said he'd be willing to deploy the military, that he would rely on the National Guard, and that he would try to induce local police departments to participate by tying federal funding to their involvement. When I said, President Trump, U.S. law prohibits the use of the military on civilians, he said that he didn't consider undocumented migrants civilians. He also, made a lot of news when I asked him about abortion. President Trump is really staking out this position on states' rights. He is saying that abortion is a states' rights issue. That's the threat. That's the needle that he's trying to thread after installing 3 Supreme Court justices who overturned Roe versus Wade. And I asked him very pointed questions about the functional outcome of that position. I said, President Trump, would you be comfortable with states prosecuting women who have gotten abortions after the ban? He said, it's irrelevant whether I'm comfortable or not because states are going to make those determinations. I said, President Trump, do you think states should monitor women's pregnancies to know if they've gotten an abortion after the ban? He said they might do that. President Trump also said that he would be willing to fire a U.S. attorney who refuses orders to prosecute someone. And President Trump overall painted a picture of someone who wants to go into office in January, if elected, and expand presidential power in a variety of ways.
In terms of the reaction to this interview, we even heard some directly from former President Trump. Listen to what he said on Tuesday of this week.
I want to thank Time magazine. They did a cover story, which is very nice, and it's actually there's at least 60%. It's at least 60% correct, which is about all I can ask for.
Praise there from the former president. Meantime, sort of on the political left, there are people sort of saying this is a hair on fire, ruinous to democracy type of interview with some of the plans from the former president. What do you make of the reaction to this from the two polar ends?
Well, look, I think it's a very rare occurrence when both Donald Trump and Joe Biden say, you should read this piece. Your viewers heard what Donald Trump said. Joe Biden called it mandatory reading. This was, I think that is due in part to the fact that I approach this interview as giving Donald Trump an opportunity to say in his own words what he would do if he returned to the White House. We believe that giving him a chance to explain in detail his plans would be a service to our readers and the American voting public.
Finally, Eric, I know you've done substantial reporting after the fact, right? Talking with people currently in government, talking with people who may be part of a potential second Trump term. What has that sort of helped you in terms of better understanding all this?
I think Donald Trump is planning to return to the White House if he wins with a group of loyalists who are going to be committed to carrying out his agenda in office. He's got an infrastructure of policy groups and think tanks that are now devoted to the MAGA creed, and he is planning to appoint to key positions in the White House, key positions in the executive branch. He's going to staff his administration with acolytes who believe in the America First doctrine. And he does not want people throughout government, whether it's, his chief of staff or a cabinet secretary or even a non-political unelected bureaucrat, to stand in the way. He wants to remove the guardrails that persisted throughout his first term. And right now he is planning to do that if he takes office again in January.
Times national political reporter Eric Cortellessa graduated from UB, Bills Mafia member. I encourage everyone to read the article, also the transcript online with Time. Eric, thanks for your time.
Thanks so much for having me, and go Bills.